from that perspective.
Yeah, no.
And that again is all part of that, managing expectations piece.
Or rec could use it for programming.
And you
Or
just
rec
didn't put the
seniors
fireplace in because
Exactly.
we're not getting to that level of detail.
I
Gotta be a
want the
fireplace.
fireplace, I want the fireplace.
We're at a concept schematic diagram.
Anyway,
And we're trying to manage snow.
Potbelly
Not
stove.
to
the
segue and manage.
That's
time too
Donating the
much, but
fireplace?
Part of
Okay,
the
John's
socks
donating
hanging
the
on.
fireplace fundraising committee.
Potbelly stove. Potbelly stove, right, Paul? Just like the old days. Yeah. Anyway, thank you guys for those comments. I really appreciate that, and you're certainly welcome to stay. And we certainly hope that you will be around as advocates for this and sort of re-energize on the community center, because I know that it was a bit of a shock for some of you. Yeah, Paul, go.
Well, I came here today because I do have concerns about the performing arts space.
We're going to talk about that.
And
We'll get to that.
are we going to talk about that now?
Yes.
Because
Yeah, I think we're pretty close.
That's
We're at
next
point
meeting.
7 now, aren't we? Because we shuffled and put
Yeah.
7 in front of 6, right?
All right.
Yeah, we moved 5 down.
So anyway, we might be calling on you guys, and don't hesitate if you see something. And these are all, this is an iteration of everything you guys have done. So if you see anything in here you don't like, just let us know for sure. And within reason, we can probably, it's conversation, and you guys have got the knowledge, and we need it. So thank you for that.
Well, there's a lot to like already. I just want to say that. It's great.
We want to redeem ourselves in your eyes.
Yeah, that's right.
Particularly
Yeah.
seriously.
Okay, so we're going to go right to the schematic design then, and input on the large multi-purpose room with the design team here.
Yeah, so knowing that we were going to talk about this, we spent some time looking at the multi-purpose room in particular and listening to the comments that we've heard about how that space might be used. And so we thought it might be helpful to just review kind of the design criteria for the room and why it is in its form at the moment, and then present what we see as an improvement to that in order to try to address a bunch of the concerns.
And before you do, just like interrupt a little bit. This is our first meeting since council approved going forward into the next phase of the project, towards this next gate. And ultimately, this phase of the project was to do what's known as design development, where we're getting to a more granular level of detail of design and not adding new program space, not changing program space. And we start engaging the other elements of the design and engineering industries, structural, mechanical, electrical engineers, to bring and layer in their information into the project. And you probably all have heard this before if you've gone through a project like this before, but if you haven't, I want to acknowledge that part, but also acknowledge that we actually didn't now finish schematic design in a sense, and that's based on comments. Thank you, Paul, and get the best project possible. So even though we've kind of wrapped up that gate, we aren't in the correct phase of the project, so we are behind schedule. And there is a fast approaching, more realistic deadline than the first phase of the project, where we were doing the best as we can to develop a strategic approach of getting a design concept together that would be approvable. We passed that gate. That was a huge hurdle. But now we're into sort of getting a little bit more nitty gritty with our scope, schedule, budget, and mainly the schedule and deliverables. So we're going to have to monitor ourselves a little bit more closely in terms of keeping on track with the deliverables and performance. And I'm not trying to be a heavy. I'm just seeing that as a real factor to getting this project successful to the end gate, is that there is finance deadlines, there's election deadlines, there's a referendum from the fire hall that's been approved. So there's a momentum, and we need to follow it, otherwise we'll lose the way.
So basically you're saying don't get too carried away with changes, is that what you're
Yeah.
saying? Okay.
Yeah, and I mean,
Quick, she's quick.
that's been our approach as well, in terms of what can we do in order to make improvements that will make a difference. and still stay within the bounds of what our project is right now, so that we're not gonna have to go back and reapprove schematic design or anything like that.
Exactly.
Okay. Is everybody ready?
Still early days.
Ready.
Okay, so
Ready.
what we were going to start with was the schematic design report, and went through sort of all of the design, but I think everybody's up to speed with the design report. And so, purpose of today really was to focus on the large multipurpose room, and how that space is going to be used. And it's helpful to have had a bit of conversation about the design overall for the building. That this is a multi-purpose room. It's got to perform a bunch of different functions. It's going to be a busy room, and it's likely going to be an expensive room in order to be able to adapt to different programs going on. So there, at its simplest, there is retractable seating in order to quickly transform a room from being auditorium style to being a large open room. So just going through some of the criteria for why the design is shown the way it is right now. One component is a sound block. We want to isolate the room to make it controllable from a sound and light point of view.
You isolate it from the rest of the building.
Isolate it with a vestibule from the rest of the building, so you can sneak in without opening the door and having all the lights spill in, and somebody be like, "Oh, it looks like somebody's late." That kind of thing. That's, you wouldn't necessarily need that when it's being used during the day for a children's program with big plastic toys and that sort of thing. But it was one of the design elements. That's what's shown on the plan. Another key idea was to connect to the outdoors. That this is a really large space and may be used for weddings or for yoga or for other group activities where you want a connection to the forest, because from Bowen Island it's lovely. It's something worth celebrating. So glazing on the east side out to the forest was shown on the design. A view from the living room space was also an important design criteria. Parents can watch their kids while they're in some activity inside while they're having a coffee. Sounds like
In
what
that
people
scenario.
maybe wanted to do.
The seating is retracted, John's out there having coffee.
Yeah, so if you can imagine, the seats all stack up to this line here, and there may be a visual connection. You won't hear the screaming kids that are inside the room, but you'll be able to watch and wave to them. So, that was another design criteria.
Just a comment, just save some space for landscaping on the bottom right corner, because that lot in front is going to change dramatically. It won't be a view of the forest
Well,
on
and
that side. It'll be a view.
Cool.
Yeah,
you'll get to it, but our next iteration might even address it better. So, another component of the design was to have an entrance to the community center that is going to be active, that there's going to be some view to the inside space, that we identify kind of this gallery space where there might be artwork or some furnishings along this space in order to draw people in and show that this is a place for the community. So those are some key features of the design. Inside the space, it's shown here with the seats out and stage area. There'd be lighting, sound system, that kind of thing. So in the evening, when there's a production on or a musical performance or choral group or that sort of thing, you would have an actual seated audience set up, draperies, and we talked about a crossover space, and it is currently not a really well thought out crossover space using just draperies. And so that's highlighted just as one of the design criteria so that we can compare now to potential improvement.
And level flow.
And another design criteria was essentially, as a multi-purpose room, this would be a single level floor.
No raised stage.
No raised stage, or stage as risers as opposed to fixed raised stage. So
Well, with the tiered seating looking down, then the flat stages.
Correct.
Correct.
That's,
Flat floor.
Yeah.
that's what,
No
So-
problem. It's, we've,
with the seats.
What we are looking at now is, oh, sorry, let me just try to control this speed here.
So is this the next?
What we're looking at now
Evolution?
is an iteration that we think might be an improvement,
Copy.
and so
except
I
we
can-
use the
So the
view.
steering committee hasn't seen this, just so everyone
Correct.
knows, new, no.
brand new, straight off the drawing board. Essentially, the idea is to switch the orientation of the seating so that rather facing out to the forest, the seating retracts back along this solid wall and faces this direction. This would be the stage area. And there are a number of things that,
Did you keep the 180 plus seats?
same seating.
It's the
Same size room.
room.
Let me see if I can switch pages without zooming out. No? Okay. So going through the same criteria, we've shown again a connection to the outdoors, and in this case, we're offering it as it's actually an improvement because it creates an aspect on the site that we didn't really have before. Before, everything was really just facing east. So what this is doing now is creating a room that just gives you a more variety of spatial experience. So you'd be looking out into the courtyard space where you may actually have activity that's connected to what's happening in the room.
Could you have access to the courtyard from that wall so that you, if you're having a big function, they can just flow out to the
The
patio?
grade
Yeah,
is
you
essentially
could.
the same.
At the moment, what we've done is we haven't shown that just for the sake of, you know how we've been wanting to control that space.
Yeah.
Glazing and openings in that space compromise its ability to really be sealed off acoustically and from a light point of view. So yes, we can talk about it. Yes, it's possible. It may not be advisable.
Acoustic glazing, also just for you, it's like sealed unit window glass, but it's
Yeah.
this much thicker.
Yeah.
This also goes to the pattern language, light from two walls in a room.
That's great.
Sorry, Paul, you want to say something?
Tech booth?
We'll get to
Yeah.
tech booth. What's that one? Glazing out toward the road, which up until now we've kind of avoided, but at the location it is, it's still over 100 feet to the road, and at the location it is, there would likely be some remaining trees as a bit of a screen. And from an acoustic point of view, at the moment, we're working on a project where we're separating library mezzanine from gymnasium with floor-to-ceiling glazing. So we're well-versed in how to control that sound transmission.
And just from a cross-section perspective, did you do something? I'm just curious about the tiered seat aspect and the glazing and what there's lots of options for glazing, so just so people around the table have an idea of the concept of.
This glazing would likely go down to the floor. When the seating is pulled out,
That's
Yeah,
140 seats pulled into the wall.
yeah.
That's
So
the lecture theater, at the
So
new
would the seats
hospital
pull, so would the seats pull in front of the
in
glazing?
Calgary.
the seats would pull in front of the glazing, and likely you would have blinds for the glazing and drapery
I'm
in
just
order
curious
to
if
make the
the
separation.
glazing was like clear story or if it was pulled in front.
Yeah, no, this would be viewable direct. Again, we have a vestibule, sorry I didn't mention that at the beginning, but same vestibule setup, but in this case a bit better because it's straight through rather than turning a corner. And so this goes to the comment of really being able to improve the idea of loading if you've got carts.
That becomes your loading bay.
Yeah, exactly. And this site is small and accessible only from one point from the road, and so the idea of a loading bay is not something that's super easy to solve, but with ramps at the main entry,
Yeah.
double doors in, or basically an at-grade entry at the back if you wanted to pull a van up and load things in. It's a longer distance, but at least you've got a double door width. You can get a grand piano through.
We see the
We have to have
building.
storage for a grand piano, by the way.
We see the building being analogous to Granville Island Market, for instance, where there is no back door. And you think, well, that doesn't work. I mean, I go to Safeway to shop, and there's a back door, and we never see where the groceries come in. that Granville Island is hugely successful, and in part because of that activity. So if you see a band unloading instruments and drums and stuff, you know there's a crew that's going to be.
It's all
Yeah.
set up, that's
Right.
right.
So we don't actually see that being necessarily a negative or a constraint, that in fact it might be a positive thing.
Yeah. As we flipped the seating orientation around, that was the one move. The other thing we did is we pulled it a little bit further away from the main entrance of the building in order to create more of a living room space. Before it was more like a gallery, a circulation zone in order to get backstage. Now it's more of a sort of intimate scale, it's more of an intimate scale living room or series of living rooms.
Is that
And so
8
that-
feet or 10 feet wide?
No, this is like,
16.
yeah, 14,
Okay.
16 feet wide.
So have we increased the square footage of the
Like the
building?
room. It's like the width of the room.
Not really. Like, yeah, within sort of line thicknesses and stuff like that. So it's essentially the same area building. And this offers perhaps a better integration of like seating, visual connection to the multi-purpose. It would need to be able to be closed off, obviously, when there's a performance where you need this backstage to be dark and quiet. But perhaps a better orientation.
It activates the front entrance as well from a public realm perspective. As opposed to
Right.
just some artwork, you actually see human beings inside the building, which is good.
Yeah. Okay, that was I missed that one. There you go. Activates the entry.
You're ahead of us.
Brought to you by
Slow down.
Coffee shop there too, John.
And then one of the key things we were trying to solve is a more improved crossover solution. One of the things Paul had mentioned was an actual crossover hallway that's separate with a wall, in order that you don't have some kid running by backstage behind the curtain and the curtain goes, you see their little feet underneath or something like that. Or to have people, they're off stage and they're getting ready to go on, but you can hear them in the back behind the curtain. So the idea that there might be a sound separation for the crossover was one thing we were trying to solve. And what we have here that we think is maybe not ideal, but an improvement, is that you could essentially have both of those conditions. You could have a crossover from one side or the other side, including a light lock, so you're not going to end up sending a whole bunch of brightness in behind this curtain. But you could have a crossover behind a curtain, or in a pinch, if you really needed to, you could circulate out through the public area, and that way you'd have both solutions.
Can I just ask, I'm not quite sure what the term crossover means.
It's just exit stage right, exit stage left. All the leprechauns have to get to the other side.
Often the
Yeah.
Oh, so it's
right
like going
now,
off as an actor and you need
So
They need to come back on the other
you
side.
need to
Yeah.
enter,
You
there's a
can,
way of getting, okay.
you can marshal kids when you've got a dance, we had originally dance school here that needed, or Vix has said that they would use it for their productions and so on. So you have to marshal kids somewhere, they have to get to one side or the other, often you have a number of people in a production. So you need to be able to get from one side to the other without being seen. To do it out in the lobby is not optimum, but we've done it before. So
Yeah,
we're
if
starting to get
anything,
into it.
the
It's
people who
very
are late
important
for the
to be able to
performance
cross
could be
over.
like,
The original drawing, to go, the door was opening in a weird way.
Yeah.
So, anyway, but this is much more doable.
Part of the challenge is that there's nothing in the program for that space.
Yeah.
Like we never allocated space for a crossover. That's
Well,
part
but we
of
did, because we handed you a drawing.
Yeah,
Well,
I think it's
that
part of
drawing
it's
and
me
the program
saying
we received
$10
are two
million
different
top
things.
off, and the
I'm
floor,
sorry?
part of it is probably me saying, looking at the floor area of the building, every square foot is a cost. And having
Yeah.
a dedicated crossover space
Yeah.
becomes a cost pressure immediately.
Yeah, but there's ways that Liz is selling one, it doesn't have to be full height. You could eliminate like 2 feet and add 2 feet out. You could, there's a lot of different solutions where you
Yep.
don't increase square
well,
footage.
and one thing we
Yeah.
actually
You need
considered
function.
was,
It has to have function, otherwise you've
But
lost.
the idea is we can also use the crossover space when
Yeah.
there's no production going on.
well, and that's
Yeah, yeah.
essentially
No,
the
this is-
Yeah.
I like this.
the conversation that we had was, well, it would be easy enough just to add that corridor in behind.
Mhm.
and then you could actually have that exactly like you want it. The hard part is that we're trying to do a bunch of things with this room.
Yeah, you're trying
And
to-
this connection of like parents watching kids,
Yeah.
it's actually a pretty real need. And so if we can manage to use it in this way, then we can actually use it for multi-functions, as opposed to saying, well, it would be great if you could see in, but we've got this single purpose corridor, so.
Well, I like to see it because, you know, you've got the roundhouse, you've got, you've got the new center in West Vancouver there, where people are watching their kids from outside. That's a really valuable addition to the experience.
Jackie?
Yeah, Craig, I just had a couple questions, just clarification, because I'm not quite clear, excuse me, Kathy. So, apologies if I get this wrong. So, is this a wall here, or is this?
That's glass, but
So
they
we-
have-
That's glazing.
there are ways
Yeah.
to
How are you
remediate
saying
that.
that we would go around, like you're
Okay,
using this, so
here.
where is the egg?
So these two rooms here would be change rooms.
Right?
This would be a washroom.
That's a great
So,
configuration.
You could go from off stage and you
Right.
could sneak in this door behind the curtains. See the curtains,
Sure.
nobody can see right in here, right? And
Those
then
are
you
the
go,
wiggly lines.
ta-da!
Okay.
Or
Hi, I'm Craig.
you could sneak along back here behind the curtain, behind the
Right.
curtain, behind the
Yeah.
curtain, and then jump out here.
Right.
Or
Yeah, it's this
yeah,
way.
if you have 10 kids and they all have to make an exit from the other side, you'd like sneak around here.
Okay.
Which is
And you
actually
sneak in
beautiful.
through this door and then close it so that it's dark, and then you can make it out.
So it's this way.
That's for the big,
It's a lot of sneaking around, I know.
It's actually quite a bonus when you're talking about productions with kids.
Yeah.
The acoustic part.
No, the being able to bring them out of the performance.
Well-
Yeah, like so that they're not disrupting whatever.
yeah, so they could all be amassed in that sitting room area and then directed to where they're going. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just before we go too much further, I want people to remember that when you look up in a theater, it looks like this. You have
Yeah.
a pile of stuff up in the
Yeah.
ceiling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, what you have to do with those three windows that you've got, 1, 2, 3, yeah, is obviously you have to make them light-proof for productions. You know, how far up those windows go will be determined by the equipment you've got up in the ceiling, all the pipes and lights and stuff, because you don't want people looking up in a theater. You know, so having windows is actually a good thing. If you can, and I know you know this, they have to be able to be easily light-proofed.
Yeah.
But the configuration of the dressing rooms is far better than what you had before.
Yeah.
This is definitely workable.
The other, yeah, what we've done on other projects with the light proofing of,
Yeah.
you know, windows to the exterior and that sort of thing is that you can get full blackout blinds that actually run in
Inside.
tracks.
Yeah.
You know, they run in tracks down the side of the gym and into a track at the bottom, and so it literally like it's full blackout. And then
Push a button.
you have your theatrical drapery that is on its own tracks that you can adjust.
I'll just say, kind of as to add that K-Meek did a lot of things that were really expensive, and you don't need to be expensive to make this thing light-proof. You could do it fairly cheaply, not cheaply, but you know, you can do it fairly reasonably.
Cardboard.
But don't go the K-Meek route. You know, we don't need architectural masterpieces. What we need is a functional room that is reasonably beautiful.
Yeah, and easy to transform too. I
Yeah,
mean, when we're talking about that
Thank you.
retractable seating,
Transformation.
we're gonna spend some money on that retractable seating because it needs to be like, go push the button, the seating needs to be gone. Like, these kids are needing to come in right now, so
Right.
stuff like that needs to happen
So
quick.
the seating is a big one. K-Meek has a hydraulic seating system, the studio theater I'm speaking of now, which is so heavy they had to reinforce the floor. It's a pain in the neck. You've got Evergreen, their seats are too close together. They had to manufacture a wedge-shaped cushion with everybody's seats because their knees are too close to the seat in front of them. You have to, you know, the roundhouse, you have to clamp the seats together. You have to have,
Every seat.
they're in seats of 3. They're in banks of 3. So anybody moves around, everything moves around. There are only certain companies that make one that is worth it. And I'm going to say it again, that the new Children's Hospital in Calgary, their lecture theater has Kodiak, which is out of Winnipeg, which are the best seats I've ever seen. They're really comfortable. You don't have to, it's turnkey. You turn it, zoop, they come out. They go back into the wall. It's only that much of your space is gone. You've got 140 seats and you can fit another 60 in front with
Perfect thing to
stacking
fundraise for.
chairs.
Yeah, it's a,
So, yeah, that's what
it's
you want.
worth
You want-
spending the money on
Sure.
that as opposed
You're
to,
looking at maybe a couple $100,000 or something, I don't know what they cost, but you don't wanna go with the hydraulic like KV. And you don't, like, we looked at seating quite extensively, and yeah, you know.
Okay, I want to acknowledge something that you mentioned at, I think, one of the council meetings that I don't see being achieved, and I hate being the guy bringing up something that's not being achieved, but I want to acknowledge it, and that was the back wall, Paul. You'd mentioned something about a screen.
Okay, I've got a picture of one right here.
oh yeah,
And
for,
and I just want to bring it up to acknowledge
for
that it's
backdrop.
not being achieved, so that it doesn't come up again
This,
in the
this is,
future.
this is what it looks like when you've got the screen in place.
Screw.
So this is the Shadbolt Theater, which I consider to be the best small theater in this, probably in the country. It's really great, the Shadbolt Studio Theater. That you achieve that, you can achieve that by, it just comes down on a roller.
yeah.
So we can achieve
So we
that
can
other way.
achieve
Yeah.
that.
We
Yeah,
can achieve
exactly.
that here. Because
And where you put, it would have,
Be
it
in
would
front of
probably
the
come down
drapery.
just behind the crossover curtain.
Right.
So it erodes a little bit of crossover space, but then you can pull the curtains in front of it. Pull it. You'd probably,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
But it would be
Is
up.
that a screen that you
You'd
can
have to
use
be
for
able
a
to roll
theater
it up
screen?
or go down.
Is
And
that a
then it
theater
would
screen?
clamp to the
What's the
floor so
purpose
it
of
stays stiff or fairly.
Well, it's got a
It's
pipe
direct.
in the
So
bottom.
use the lights on
Projector.
it, okay.
It might
Okay,
even
cool.
be, have a, a secure point on either end or
Does it
whatever.
operate as a viewing screen?
But what it does is you can project a
know.
cityscape behind the theater production. You can do, it
No,
could
but
be a
if we
movie.
were,
It can be
if
used
we
for
were
people.
wanting to watch
It
a
could be
movie,
anything.
could we
It
use
could
it
be used
for
as a movie
viewing?
Okay.
Yeah, because we will want a screen to come down for a viewing screen.
Yeah, your
So-
short
so
throw
if-
projector
Like
can
that.
shoot
Yeah.
down onto it.
So, I mean, that would be my suggestion, because, you do want to retain the windows there.
Yeah,
So,
and that kind of thing is super versatile. It's like, it's like a motorized projection
That's
screen,
right.
and it's just, all of a sudden it's gone and
It
you've got
doesn't
your
go
room
wing to
back,
wing,
so.
it just- I mean, it does go wing to wing, but it doesn't go right wall to wall.
Are you at a point to address how and where the sound and lights would be run effectively?
Yeah, you talk about control booth.
Yes.
You're right, it's gone. It was never really in our program at all. It was a bonus space because we added a bit to the volume, and essentially it was only accessible when the bleachers were out. You could walk up the bleachers and there was space in behind the last seat. But what we have heard from people who are doing this a lot now is that depending on the technology that you use for sound and for lighting, a lot of LED lighting systems now don't require, this kind of board. You can essentially have digital control and have a remote from an iPad, that kind of thing.
So you're just talking size, but you still need it to be in the center at the back for sound, so I mean, that's what it looks like at the Shadwell. I hate to be showing everybody pictures all the time. That's the state of the art. You don't need it that big.
Yeah, and
In
so
terms of
that,
the booth, that's what's in it. You don't need that. You need to run this thing, you need a board that's probably about twice the size of that.
Well,
So
that's
you
the thing
could
is
do that from a seat at
And
the
you need a
back.
lot more for sound.
Well, not anymore. It is true that the engineers that I work with and the artists prefer the remote control of the sound, because then they can go down on the stage and deal with the monitors on the stage. They can be wherever they need to be in the house rather than locked behind a board, which usually in theaters is stuck behind glass at the back. It's usually in a really bad place anyway. So it's a matter of whether or not there is space above the first row or the last row of
Yeah.
the retractable seating for at least an area.
or whether it is the back row, a portion of the back row that is used.
middle of the back
Then
row.
you gotta put a table in with long legs on the front and
Well, it's not out of the question
You
for,
eliminate at least 6 seats.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
cheaper and makes the space
Why
more
would we do
versatile.
When you're building a purpose-built
Just
space,
with
to me, it doesn't make sense not to
Sherry,
have
so where
Space
is
is
not a
Sherry,
curve.
where are
at
you
least
talking about?
an 8 by.
Back there.
well, the center of the back is the ideal place, so
Yeah.
whether or not it's incorporatable, is that the word? With the retractable seating, since that's not something that you can adapt to make a space for, but you can in terms of having a table set up that's custom designed to just take up a certain number of seats in the back. But I would be inclined to talk to, because my daughter is a sound engineer, and as is your partner, who's working at the Chan right now. And I would want to confer with him.
Yep.
Because he's the one who tends to say, the board is actually like having a soundboard. I'm assuming it is the same for lights, but that it's harder for them to do good sound anchored to a
Well,
board.
The other thing that we had talked about was that the bulk of the adjustment and the setup is typically done before the performance anyway.
Yes.
So a lot of that can happen sitting anywhere really, because nobody's there.
But not the
Yeah.
theater.
We don't
Then,
have
then there's the
floors.
active stuff, and so the question for us, as we get into the more detail about designing this, is how much is needed for the setup ahead of time, where we've got lots of room and adjustment? How much is really needed during performance?
Operations.
How much space does it really take, so that we can, again, like, only do what's necessary, so that when that event isn't happening at that particular moment, that space is actually gonna be useful for something else. That's our challenge with, like, literally every square inch of this building.
Well, theater, you absolutely need you need to run.
Yeah, you need
to
active
run the
lighting.
show. So
But then the
run-
question to you
run the
is
show.
like,
I'd
okay,
say you need
what's
about
your
6 by
minimum?
8
Is it a
space.
6x6 or a 6x4 space?
It's not much. You need 2 chairs and a table of that size.
Yeah, okay, so now we're talking. This is good. And it doesn't need to be behind glass.
No,
Yeah.
it's preferable not to be
No, you don't want.
What's the,
So I think,
So two
what's the
chairs.
cross section on that look like? Is there any space above those seats when they're folded back in?
No, they go, because it backs straight.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, higher.
Do they
Of course,
go
then
right
there's
to
an
the
access.
roof or
Yeah.
the ceiling?
No, I've got it from the side. That's what it looks like from the side.
yeah,
So you know,
yeah, no, it's only accessible when the,
yeah.
oh, sorry. Waving point.
John had an idea.
John, not John.
John's leaving.
Yep, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
John,
Thanks, John.
We'll be in touch.
we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
In terms of wall treatment, if you have, for acoustics, I'm not an acoustics expert, I know if you have multifaceted walls, you get better sound. So I would encourage you to go look at the new convention center downtown. It's all,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if anybody hasn't seen it, it's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
And then huge rooms that are acoustically okay. So,
We have MC Squared, Barry McKinnon is going to be doing acoustics for us.
oh, perfect.
And there's a lot of
Yeah.
similar kinds of.
Because you can only tune so much, like if you have, with
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Scotiabank Dance Center, they have bright walls, and they have to baffle them all the time with cloth and stuff. You can't baffle low-end sound with cloth.
Yeah.
So, you know, the way that you do, and the Surrey Arts Center Studio Theater has, you know, rough edged, you know, breeze block, and that works fine for them too, but anyway,
Will that company
Yeah.
also deal with the sound equipment? Or would that be
Less
somebody
so.
else that you?
Less so,
can
they deal
do-
mostly with the room itself,
Building
in
materiality.
terms of understanding its geometry, its finishes, its reverberation.
But
all
I've
that sort of
had him do, on a couple of projects, do a complete sound system for some rooms. So
Sure.
they have.
In terms of speaker
And there's a new
placements.
resident of
placement,
Bowen
too.
Island who's, works with a very large sound company.
But I'm wondering, like, if we get, if your daughter and son-in-law would allow us to pick their brains too, I mean, hands-on experts, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too.
Yeah.
If they both have their masters at McGill. Sound recording and live sound.
I don't feel like we quite left the sound and light booth or space.
Yeah, and
for-
that's, I'm already thinking, okay, I'm gonna talk to them about that, because they're working in modern theaters and they're.
Depending on the
Hands-on.
nature of the organization, we could set up, for instance, the very top last tier to be fixed and have the balance of the seating retract from there. And some portion of that back row could be a couple of seats that are dedicated to sound and light, for instance.
Yeah,
And that seems,
Oh, really?
there is
Yeah,
a
I've
bit
seen-
of a problem in that if you're sitting in amongst the line and run, there's lights involved in boards
Yeah,
and stuff. They
especially
have to
with
have a
the
certain amount of
access.
light.
They could have
They're
some
looking at
kind of
their cue
screening or
sheet
something,
and stuff like that. So, in that respect, it's better to have them in a separate room, because there is.
There's night vision goggles now.
I'm kind of hearing two different things.
Yeah, well, sounding like the different,
Sound
like-
different needs.
Well,
yeah,
no,
or-
theater
and
and
music
music
have
is really
different
different.
needs, yeah.
And different kinds of music as well, you have choral music, you have orchestral, you have folk.
I think it would be-
The thing is, if
Great
it's,
to
if
talk
it
to
becomes
your family
adamant to have an
Yes.
enclosed
Yes.
booth, it becomes a greater architectural challenge to, determine where that is, how you get to it, how that's articulated in the overall volume of the building and so on, right? It's not simply we need a lighting booth and it's got to be enclosed, and so we need to sort of, if that's a showstopper, if that's like going to make or break the building, we need to know that.
Yeah,
Well, I think it's important. The K-Meek studio, they tried to put it in a corner, which is
That's the worst place to be for
It's
yourself.
the worst place to be.
Yeah.
But if you look at the Roundhouse, it's completely flexible space, which means they can turn the entire thing around. And they do it, they have a cable. It's like a snake that goes out, so the snake can go along, or else they have a little trough along up above. And so you can actually, you might think about having access to that kind of a thing where you can plug it into the back.
So maybe this is getting too technical and detailed for this.
This-
We recognize
Well,
that we've
just
got
level, I
to
think
do
so,
it.
yeah.
It's worth having this conversation
I think
for
we need
sure,
to have-
but what
With
we
a
are
subgroup.
getting
Very valuable.
into, what we
Yeah.
are getting into is more design development kind of questions, which integrate expertise from other places. So that is our next work for the building.
I would
I think what
recommend-
we're presenting here, though, is essentially a pretty major conceptual shift in how we're going to use the building, schematic design level. And if we can sort of yay or nay this, that would enable us to keep going. I think
What I've heard is that
The
this is
overall-
good, we just need to resolve that light and
do
sound
that.
control
That's-
area.
and I think that can happen through design development.
And there'll still be some fine tuning to go on, but
And we know that
premise is
here,
Yeah.
here,
something,
Yeah.
okay. So I recommend that because Roundhouse has just replaced their seating, their retractable seating. They spent $200,000 on replacing it all, and they've moved the sound booth. I don't know if it's shiftable anymore, but the sound booth is now at the very top tier. So there's
Right.
some way that I didn't even make it up there at the last show, but there's some way that they
Understandable.
incorporated it so that it's not